In this video, I'll take you through a step-by-step tutorial where we'll build a Super Mario Bros. Inspired platformer game using both Excel and VBA Code. This guide will cover all the key mechanics from player movement to gravity, enemies, game loops, and more. If you haven't already seen the gameplay video that outlines the core gameplay, customizing your own level, customizing player characters and enemy characters, then check that out now before you watch the rest of this video. Let's get started. First, we need to set up our own workbook. Let's create a macro-enabled Excel file so that we can save down a blank Excel spreadsheet and enable code to work. Secondly, we need to ensure that the developer tools are enabled that allow VBA to function. To do this, we need to go to File, Options, Customize Ribbon, and ensure that the developer box is ticked. Step 2 is our to-do list and game map. With our Excel workbook set up, let's put together a list of all the elements of the game that we want to build out. This is a short list for all the game mechanics that we want to create. Everything from creating the game character sprites to spawning the game and enemy characters. Logic for moving the player character and logic for moving the enemy character, and much more. You'll notice here that I bit off a little bit more than I could chew, as the gameplay window didn't work as intended. So instead, I built an Excel scroll function that follows the game character left and right instead. With our list complete, let's focus on nailing the game map design. My focus for this game was recreating the feeling of playing Super Mario Bros. For the first time, so nailing the size of the game board was important. The cell widths are 4.43 units or 36 pixels, and the cell heights are 27 units or 36 pixels. I used colored fill cells to recreate the floor, sky, clouds, plants, pipes, and flags for World 1-1 of Super Mario Bros. This became the prototype for the rest of the game. Now, let's create the Game Hub tab for the game area, and a Character Sprites tab for sprites for both the player and enemy goon characters. In the Game Hub tab, let's reserve a range of cells for our game grid. These will be cells C3 to HQ15. In the Character Sprites tab, we will store the shapes for the player and enemies. We will write some VBA code to spawn these shapes into the Game Hub tab as game elements where we need them. The third part is the core mechanics, a devlog of how each element impacts the game. Let me take you on a journey with how this game came together. We'll get into the detail of the code afterwards. My first intention was to spawn a game display screen, similar to how you would hold a gameplay of old, which would focus on a window that would update as the player moved. Put it frankly, I couldn't get this working. It started with setting up a screen and spawning our game character into the display. As you can see here, the game character instantly fell out of the screen as gravity was activated. This was because the orange floor tiles are incorrectly read in VBA, so I switched to a black color palette later instead to get this to work. Also, the game display location was wrong. Instead of fixing the game display, I pivoted to using a game hub instead. This adjusted how levels will work in the game, setting the environment for the total of 3 levels and introducing the game hub. With this game hub, I was quite easily able to get the A and D keys read after the player was spawned to move my Mario-inspired character left and right respectively. Next, we needed to add some impassable objects. These are things like blocks and pipes that stop Mario from just cleanly moving through them, instead being a jumpable, landable object. Then we got the jump mechanic and gravity to work. The key here is to have the code only enable gravity when the player is not jumping and not standing above a black cell. I was having trouble with the game code recognizing orange cells for the floor, so as I mentioned earlier, I switched this to a black cell. We also managed to get the basics of the game over and victory conditions to be met. The victory conditions are simple. If the player character crosses the far right horizontal threshold, it's a victory. If the player character falls below the vertical threshold, it's a game over, also clearing the game map. Then we got the enemy characters to spawn and patrol a set boundary. If the player character intersects the same tile as one of the enemy goons, then a game over is also triggered. I also worked through the level select triggers and customize options of both the player characters and level design. For details on how to do these, check out the gameplay video I mentioned in the introduction. If you do like this sort of content, please do like and comment to support this channel. Now for the meat and bones, the code walkthrough. Let's talk code. The first piece of code is importing the Windows API for key press detection. This allows our game to detect key presses when moving left, right, and jumping. To do this, we use a Windows API function called getAsyncKeyState. This will allow our game to respond to the player's input in real time. The second piece of code are global variables and game constants, which manage the game state. Player stores the player shape. Game running controls whether the game is in a running state or a stopped state, and is jumping checks if the player is in a jumping state. We also have an array goons to hold up to 10 enemy characters, and goon directions to check whether the enemy is moving left or right each game tick. In terms of constants, these help to define the boundaries of the game. For example, left bound and right bound determine where the player can move horizontally, while upper bound and lower bound determine the vertical limits. The third piece of the code relates to the main game loop. The game loop is the heartbeat of our game. It continuously checks for key presses, applying gravity, and moves the enemy goons. Each iteration of the game loop represents a tick of the game clock, and we use the tick counter to track these ticks. For example, goons move every 2 ticks, and gravity is applied every tick. The fourth piece of code is for player movement. The move player subroutine moves the player based on the specified horizontal and vertical offsets. It checks for boundaries and impassable tiles before moving the player and handling game over or victory conditions. The fifth piece of the code is the gravity and jump mechanics. Gravity is what pulls the player down unless they're on top of an impassable tile or jumping. The apply gravity subroutine runs every 2 ticks and checks if there is a space below the player. If so, the player moves down 1 cell. That game tick. Jumping moves the player upwards by 4 cells. While jumping, the player can still move left or right by pressing the A or D keys. We also use the is jumping flag to prevent double jumps. The sixth piece of code handles both game over and victory conditions. If the player reaches row 15, the game ends with a game over message. Alternately, if the player reaches the far right column, they get the victory message. Both conditions stop the game, clear the game map, and reset references for the players and the goons. The seventh piece of code is to control enemy movement for the goons. This subroutine spawns up to 10 goons based on the range of cells specified in the worksheet. Each goon starts at its leftmost boundary and begins moving right. Goons patrol back and forth between their defined left and right boundaries. This is handled in the move goon subroutine, which checks their direction and moves them accordingly. If a goon collides with a player, it also triggers a game over. This forms the majority of the key code within our VBA modules. Feel free to read through them all at your leisure. You can download the game in the link in the description below. And there you have it. You know how to build a platformer game in Excel, complete with player movement, gravity mechanics, enemy behavior, and win and lose conditions. Feel free to customize your game further by adding new levels or new mechanics. To see how some of this customization is done, check out the gameplay video now. If you found this tutorial helpful, please like, subscribe, and leave any questions in the comments below. Next up, I'm going to make a Pac-Man game in Excel, so stay tuned for that.